It was the summer of 1993 in Minneapolis, Minnesota, a hot July day that clung to the air like static. In the quiet neighborhood of Phillips, nestled on the south side of the city, 35-year-old Jeanie Childs was going about her day inside the Francis Drake Hotel, once a grand establishment. The Drake had faded into something else entirely, a transitional residence for people down on their luck. Jeanie, a woman trying to claw her way back into stability, was one of those residents. Jeanie was known to be kind, sharp-witted, and full of life, despite the hard years behind her. She had her struggles, addiction, run-ins with the law, and stints in jail, but those close to her said she was trying to reconnect with her family, trying to rebuild. Her room at the Drake Hotel had become her small world, but on July 15th, that world came to an end in the most violent, unimaginable way. That afternoon, other tenants began to notice something strange, a foul odor wafting through the hallways. At first, it was ignored, but as hours passed, it intensified. Eventually, someone knocked on the door of room 16. No answer. The manager opened the door, and what he found would haunt Minneapolis law enforcement for the next 26 years. Inside was the mutilated body of Jeanie Childs. The scene was gruesome. Blood splattered on walls, floor, and ceiling. Jeanie had been stabbed more than 30 times. There were signs of a struggle, yet no one in the building claimed to have heard a thing.
No forced entry.
No clear motive. Just a young woman, brutally killed and left behind. The Minneapolis Police Department launched an immediate investigation. Detectives canvassed the area, interviewed residents, and looked for anyone who might have seen Jeanie that day. But the hotel's transient population made it nearly impossible to track down witnesses. Some were gone within hours, others refused to talk, and the physical evidence? Minimal. No murder weapon was found. DNA technology, still in its infancy, couldn't yet make sense of what little forensic material was collected. Still, a few things stood out. Detectives found a partial palm print. They also recovered traces of biological material under Jeanie's fingernails, suggesting she fought back. Most disturbing was the fact that, despite the ferocity of the murder, there were no defensive wounds consistent with an intruder being forced to enter. Whoever killed Jeanie may have been let in. Hinted at something chilling. She likely knew her killer. But the case quickly went cold. Leads dried up. The evidence, stored in a box, was shelved, literally and figuratively. Every year, Jeanie's family would ask about progress. Every year, the answer was the same. Nothing. And so her story faded into the background. One more unsolved case, buried by time, until 2019. That year, the Minneapolis Police Department began revisiting cold cases using modern DNA technology. One of the detectives assigned to the task force reopened the Jeanie Childs file. They submitted samples for genealogical DNA testing, the same method that had brought justice in the Golden State Killer case. It was a long shot. But what came back changed everything. A familial match had been made. The DNA didn't directly identify someone, but it linked to a distant relative. With the help of genealogists, detectives built a family tree, thousands of names. Slowly, methodically, they narrowed it down, and one name rose to the top. Jerry Westrom, a businessman, father, a hockey dad, a man with no violent criminal record. On paper, he didn't fit the profile. But his DNA matched through discarded. Napkins retrieved at a hockey game was a direct match to the material found at the Jeanie Childs crime scene, including DNA under her fingernails. The police placed him under surveillance. They waited. They collected more DNA from a sandwich. He tossed in the trash. That, too, came back positive. The odds of it being anyone else? 1 in hundreds of billions. Jerry Westrom was arrested in 2019, 26 years after Jeanie's murder. When the news broke, Minneapolis reeled. How could someone live an ordinary life with such a violent secret? Westrom denied everything, claimed he didn't know Jeanie, said he'd never been to the Drake Hotel, but the evidence was clear and overwhelming. The trial, which would come later, would expose the shocking duality of Westrum's life. But for now, as the case was reopened and charges were filed, Jeanie's family finally saw the possibility of justice. The woman whose story had been largely forgotten by the public was now on every news channel. But with new attention came new questions. Why had it taken so long? How many other cold cases were out there with matching DNA sitting in boxes? And what had happened in that room in July 1993 that turned a hotel room into a blood-soaked crime scene? Those answers, and more, would slowly emerge. What had seemed like a random, motiveless killing was far more complex. The decades had blurred memories, and some witnesses were gone. But one thing was now clear. Jeanie hadn't died in silence. She fought. And in fighting, she left behind the evidence that would eventually speak for her. As detectives dug further into Westrum's background, the picture became more troubling. While he had no serious convictions, there were whispers from his past, brushes with the law that never quite led to charges, and rumors that seemed to dissolve before reaching courtrooms. Some acquaintances described him as temperamental and volatile behind closed doors, a man who maintained a duality between suburban calm and something more erratic underneath. Police began re-examining other unsolved crimes from the early 90s in the Minneapolis area, wondering if Jeanie had been his only victim. Meanwhile, the media frenzy intensified. News vans were parked outside Westrum's home. His face appeared on every nightly broadcast. People who once shared office space or youth sports bleachers with him were stunned, some in disbelief, others claiming they always felt something was off. Through it all, Jeanie's family remained quietly composed, exhausted by years of grief but resolute in their pursuit of justice. They had waited too long for this moment. Jeanie's sister, in interviews, spoke not of revenge but of closure. "We just want her to be remembered for more than the way she died," she said. The renewed attention prompted others from the past to step forward. Former residents of the Drake Hotel, social workers, even former neighbors. Each remembered Jeanie differently, but all remembered her. Her laughter, her stubborn resilience, the way she tried to help others even when her own life was in disarray. The case, once reduced to a file in a drawer, became a rallying cry for justice, long delayed. In legal circles, Westrum's arrest became a landmark, a prime example of how far forensic science had come. Prosecutors began preparing for what would be one of the most high-profile cold case trials in state history. And in quiet corners of the Minneapolis Police Department, other boxes were pulled from storage, other names whispered back into motion. Jeanie's case was no longer just about one woman or one brutal night. It was about the system that had failed to protect her, and the technology that had finally, decades later, heard her scream. In the aftermath of Jerry Westrum's 2019 arrest, the story of Jeanie Childs spread rapidly through Minneapolis and across the nation, casting a spotlight not only on her brutal murder, but on the decades of investigative silence that had followed. What had gone so wrong in 1993? How did such a violent crime with DNA evidence available sit untouched for over 2 decades? To understand the full tragedy of this case, one has to go back to the days and weeks following Jeanie's murder. At the time, her family was devastated and confused. Her mother, sisters, and cousins showed up daily at the police precinct begging for answers. But all they got were platitudes. Investigators admitted early on that they were struggling. The neighborhood around the Francis Drake Hotel was transient, and witnesses were unreliable. Tips led to dead ends, and the scent of justice faded as quickly as it had arrived. The brutal nature of the crime scene, blood spatter in every corner of the room, indicators of a prolonged and violent struggle, the lack of witnesses or any clear motive made it a difficult case. Detectives turned their attention to Jeanie's background, interviewing past acquaintances, lovers, and anyone who might have had a reason to harm her, but nothing stuck. And as the weeks turned into months and months into years, Jeanie's case file was shelved. For many, it felt as if she had been abandoned twice, first by her killer, and then by the very system meant to protect her. Her family never stopped pushing. Her mother, in particular, contacted local news outlets annually. On the anniversary of her daughter's death, hoping to keep the story alive, sometimes a brief blurb would be published. Most years there was silence. The case became part of a growing list of unsolved crimes in Minnesota and in the nation, a ghost among many. By the early 2000s, DNA testing had advanced significantly. Cold case units began to reopen investigations that once seemed impossible to solve, but Jeannie's name never came up. The Minneapolis PD's cold case team was small, underfunded, and overwhelmed. It wasn't until 2018 that her case was reviewed once again, sparked not by new information, but by a change in policy. That year, the department partnered with a private forensic genealogy company to cross-reference biological evidence from unsolved cases with public DNA databases. When the evidence from Jeannie's crime scene, now nearly 26 years old, was reprocessed and submitted, the results were immediate and stunning. The genealogical match pointed to a distant cousin of Jerry Westrom. From there, a family tree was built, leaf by leaf, until one man's name kept surfacing. When police reviewed Westrom's background, they found nothing alarming at first glance. He was a married father of children, a middle-class businessman who sold refrigeration equipment and coached local hockey. But beneath that suburban normalcy, something darker lingered. Digging deeper, detectives found that Westrom had once lived near the Drake Hotel. In fact, in 1993, he was in the area frequently, though he claimed otherwise. His name had never come up during the initial investigation, but he was now in the crosshairs of a case that refused to stay buried. The challenge, of course, was proving it. Investigators couldn't rely on the 1993 evidence alone. They needed a fresh DNA sample. It's when they followed him to a hockey game, posing as spectators. Officers watched him eat a hot dog and wipe his mouth with a napkin he discarded. That napkin was quickly retrieved, bagged, and tested. The match was unmistakable. More samples followed. Each one tightened the noose around Westrom's carefully hidden past. But even as the arrest was made and charges were filed, questions echoed through the Minneapolis legal community. How had this gone unnoticed for so long? Had Westrom killed before? Could he kill again? And perhaps most unsettling, what had driven him to kill Jeanie Childs in such a savage, personal way? There was no known relationship between the two. According to prosecutors, Jeannie's lifestyle made her vulnerable. The state alleged that Westrom had encountered Jeanie that night, possibly in search of sex. Something had gone wrong. Perhaps he made a demand she refused. Perhaps she resisted. What was clear, based on the crime scene, was that the attack had escalated rapidly and ferociously. 13 stab wounds, blood on the walls, the ceiling, the door handle. It wasn't just a killing, it was a frenzy. And then, just as suddenly, the killer vanished. For 26 years, Westrom lived without suspicion, blending into the everyday rhythm of American life. Birthdays, soccer practices, Christmas mornings. All the while, Jeannie's family waited, cried, wondered. That long silence would become the heart of part 2 of this story, a trail of years filled with pain, false starts, and a justice system that often seemed indifferent. But now, with a suspect in custody, the silence was finally breaking, and what followed would be a courtroom drama that pulled back the curtain on a life built on lies. The resurgence of Jeannie's case in 2019 didn't just reignite the pain. For her family, it also opened a floodgate of buried memories for those who had known her in the days before her murder. Former friends and acquaintances, some of whom had managed to overcome the struggles of addiction or homelessness, came forward to share what they remembered. A woman named Carla, who had shared a room 2 doors down at the Drake, recalled hearing Jeanie arguing with someone on the day of the murder, a male voice, not one she recognized, and the slamming of a door moments before the scream that rang through the hallway. That voice haunted her memory, she said, especially when news broke about the DNA match in 2019. Another former resident, Ronnie, who had since moved to Chicago, wrote an email to the Minneapolis PD after seeing a report online. He said he saw a man in a dark jacket exit the Drake through a side door that night, moving fast, looking agitated. Ronnie hadn't reported it back then. No one listened to guys like me, he wrote. We weren't worth anything. Now, decades later, the weight of what he saw never left. The stories poured in, details long buried by trauma, addiction, and time were suddenly raw again, and the prosecutors preparing for Westrum's trial realized just how fragile memory could be, yet how deeply it could still cut. The state built its case carefully. The DNA was a linchpin, of course, but prosecutors also leaned on behavioral patterns and circumstantial links, Westrum's presence in the area, the similarities between the crime scene and descriptions of his past temper, and testimony from old acquaintances who recalled his strange moods and troubling comments about women. His defense team pushed back hard. They argued that DNA alone wasn't enough, that he could have visited Jeannie's apartment under different circumstances, that someone else could have been there after. But the forensic experts made it clear the DNA was not only found on the napkin, it matched samples collected from multiple surfaces inside the crime scene, including under Jeannie's fingernails and on the handle of the shower faucet. One by one, the prosecution laid out the timeline, reconstructing the scene with digital models, photos, and testimony. For Jeannie's family, it was excruciating. To see her death broken down into charts and images, to hear experts speak clinically about the wounds and the blood, it was a nightmare relived in high definition. Yet it was also necessary. For too long, her name had been a cold case footnote. Now it was center stage. The trial gripped the community. News crews lined the courthouse steps. Social media exploded with theories and reactions. True crime bloggers unpacked every detail. Behind the scenes, Jeannie's mother sat with folded hands, watching a man she had never met, but who had changed her life forever. She never looked away. Even when the most graphic images were shown, even when the defense tried to paint her daughter as troubled, she remained fixed like a witness, not just to justice, but to truth. It took weeks of testimony, but in the end, the evidence proved too much to overcome. The jury deliberated for just under 2 days. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous: guilty. Jerry Westrum, at long last, was held accountable for what had happened inside room 310 of the Francis Drake Hotel in July 1993. But justice didn't erase the years lost. It didn't bring Jeannie back. It didn't fill the aching space left in every family gathering, every birthday missed, every milestone denied. Still, it brought something long overdue: acknowledgement for Jeannie, for her family, for everyone who believed she deserved more than a case number and a cold file in a locked drawer. And as the courtroom emptied and the reporters scrambled to file their stories, a quiet moment lingered. Jeannie's mother placing a hand over her daughter's photo, whispering something only she could hear. Perhaps a goodbye. Perhaps a promise fulfilled. Definitely a chapter closed. Despite the conviction of Jerry Westrum, the ripples of Jeannie Child's case continued to move quietly through Minneapolis. Detective Sarah Jensen, who had dedicated the last 7 years of her career to the case, found herself standing outside the newly renovated building where Jeannie's life had been taken. The sign had changed, the walls repainted, but she could still see it: the 4th-floor apartment, the blood-smeared tiles, the desperation frozen in time. She thought of how a simple napkin had unraveled a secret buried for decades. Had seen darkness before, but this case had seeped deeper into her skin than most. She'd returned to the crime scene again and again over the years, unable to shake Jeannie's silent voice echoing from that room. And now that the trial was over, and the man responsible was behind bars, she still felt a strange hollowness inside, as if justice had only scratched the surface. She began compiling what she called a legacy folder, not for the department, but for Jeannie's family. It contained everything she'd learned that hadn't made it into court timelines, testimonies that couldn't be verified, and theories from past detectives that may never be proven. She added personal notes to how Jeannie was remembered by those who loved her, how deeply her death impacted people Jensen had never expected to interview. There was a scribbled quote from Jeannie's high school friend. She laughed like summer, loud but never obnoxious. You remembered it, even if you only heard it once. Jensen kept that line at the top of the folder, as if anchoring everything else inside. Meanwhile, Jeannie's mother, now well into her 70s, found herself inundated with requests, interviews, podcast invites, even a book proposal. But she declined them all. "Let me remember her quietly," she told a local reporter before closing the door on the world once more. The grief hadn't softened. It had only settled deeper. Her mornings began with Jeanie's photograph. The one taken at the lake, where she wore a yellow sundress and a crooked smile, her arms slung over her younger sister's shoulders. That image lived not just in a frame on the mantel, but in her memory, the last true peace she had known. The impact of the case extended far beyond Jeanie's family. Across Minnesota, cold case units began receiving renewed funding. District. Attorneys lobbied for better forensic testing budgets, citing how one match on a discarded napkin had brought a killer to justice after nearly 3 decades. Journalists returned to the story again and again, using Jeanie's name to highlight the real cost of delayed justice. For every cold case cracked, dozens remained untouched, and for each, there was a family waiting, grieving, hoping. One such family reached out to Jensen after the trial. Their daughter had vanished under similar circumstances in 1995, and though no link had ever been made to Westrom, they wondered now if he'd been in their city that summer. Jensen promised to look into it. That's how it went now. New names, new tips, new timelines. For Jensen, this wasn't just a case. It had become a mission. At home, she barely slept. She found herself rereading Jeanie's file late into the night, underlining old statements and cross-referencing hotel records from the 1990s. Her partner worried. Gently suggested taking time off, but she couldn't pull away. Something about Jeanie's story, her unfinished life, her silenced voice, had fused itself to Jensen's sense of purpose. Every case file she touched now felt personal. It was no longer just evidence and timelines. It was humanity, lost and waiting to be heard. Meanwhile, Westrom sat in a state correctional facility, his appeals already in motion. His lawyers argued procedural flaws, claimed the DNA match was circumstantial, and even tried to challenge the legality of retrieving evidence from a discarded napkin. But none of it held. The courts upheld his conviction, and the Minnesota justice system stood firm. Still, the public wanted answers. How had this man, a father, a husband, someone who owned a suburban business, managed to bury such a violent past so seamlessly? Unnerved people. If a man like that could walk free for nearly 30 years, what other ghosts were walking beside? Them unseen? Podcasts exploded with theories. Was Westrom involved in other murders? Was Jeanie his only victim, or just the one who left behind enough blood to solve the puzzle? Internet sleuths compiled timelines, mapped his past residences, speculated about unsolved cases across Minnesota and Wisconsin. Theories ranged from plausible to fantastical, but one thing was clear: the public wasn't ready to let go of Jeanie's story. Her image, that same yellow sundress photo, appeared in tribute murals and cold case awareness campaigns. The girl who had once been invisible in life became a symbol in death, of justice delayed, but not denied. Her story appeared in college courses on forensic science, and her name was added to advocacy groups fighting for better tracking of DNA evidence nationwide. In one university auditorium, a criminology student raised their hand and asked, "What if they'd never tested that napkin?" The professor paused. "Then Jerry Westrom would still be walking free," he said. That silence afterwards said everything. In Jeanie's old neighborhood, the changes were visible. The old Francis Drake Hotel had been repainted, remodeled, and renamed, but those who remembered the murder could never quite shake the old energy that lingered on the 4th floor. Some swore they could still feel her presence in the hall. A breeze where no window was open, a quiet sob in the middle of the night. It became part of the building's unofficial history, passed down through whispers and glances. Meanwhile, Jeanie's sister, once the quiet girl in the shadow of tragedy, began speaking publicly. She stood at rallies and vigils, telling her sister's story in a voice that shook but never broke. "I don't want her remembered for how she died," she'd say into microphones, "but for how she lived fiercely, brightly, and unafraid." Her words resonated across communities. Parents hugged their daughters tighter. Young women learned Jeanie's name like a cautionary prayer. And Detective Jensen, still unable to fully let go, attended every vigil. She stood at the back, hands clasped, eyes forward, her badge tucked away. She was no longer there as an officer. She was there as someone who had come to care deeply. She carried Jeanie's memory like a quiet oath. Her own daughter, just 12, had asked once, "Mom, would you catch someone who hurt me?" Jensen hadn't hesitated. "I'd never stop," she replied. That promise to Jeanie, to herself, to every silent victim, became the undercurrent of everything she did. The story of Jeanie Childs, long buried by time and bureaucracy, had erupted into the public conscience and left a mark that would never fade. In the quiet that followed the trial, as snow blanketed the streets of Minneapolis once again, a single candle burned on the steps of the old hotel. No nameplate, no sign, just a silent tribute. A life lost, a case closed, a legacy awakened. Jeanie's story had finally found its ending, but its echo would live on, not just in courtrooms or case files, but in every corner of justice where light had yet to shine. The courtroom may have delivered a verdict, but for the people closest to Jeanie Childs, the process of healing was just beginning. The final gavel did not bring closure. It brought a quiet void, a silence that demanded reflection. Detective Sarah Jensen sat alone at her desk the morning after the sentencing, her coffee untouched and her case files still stacked beside her. She should have felt relief, triumph even, but instead she felt weight. A case like Jeanie's doesn't end with a conviction. It lives on in the quiet moments, in the way every other case feels somehow less important. As the media buzz began to fade, Jensen returned to her routine, but nothing about it felt normal. She began digging into other unsolved cases with renewed intensity, specifically those with details that mirrored Jeanie's murder, brutal, quick, personal. She created a private spreadsheet listing case numbers, victim names, locations, and dates. One case caught her attention: a woman named Carla Rivers, murdered in 1996 in a small town just an hour north of Minneapolis. Like Jeanie, she had worked as a hotel cleaner and was found in a similar state, no forced entry. Defensive wounds, DNA left behind, but never matched. The similarities were enough to raise Jensen's curiosity. She retrieved the cold case file from archives, brushing off 2 decades of dust. There it was: photographs, coroner's reports, police interviews. Everything screamed familiarity. The problem was, the DNA evidence collected back then had been degraded, unusable by today's standards. Still, Jensen couldn't let it go. She reached out to the original detective on the case, now retired and living in Arizona. They spoke for 2 hours on the phone, the older man recalling details that weren't even in the file: how Carla had been afraid the week before her death, how she'd told a neighbor about a man watching her from across the street. "We thought it was paranoia," he admitted. "Now I'm not so sure." Jensen hung up, heart racing. She compiled every theory, every note, and tried to make sense of it. The overlap was there. Westrom had traveled frequently for business during the late 90s, often without explaining exactly where he'd been. His records were vague, his credit card statements inconsistent, and yet no physical evidence linked him to Carla Rivers, only a gut instinct, the same one that had kept her on Jeanie's case for years. As days passed, Jensen noticed a shift in the city. Community centers began offering self-defense courses. Women's groups held vigils not just for Jeanie, but for other women who never received justice. At one such vigil, Jensen stood in the back of the crowd, not in uniform, simply observing. Candles flickered as names were read aloud, including Carla Rivers. Jensen looked around. People were listening. That night, she sat in her car long. After the vigil ended, replaying each name in her head like a mantra. Back at the precinct, Jensen reopened a string of cases previously listed as unrelated. These included victims with no family to advocate for them, women like Jeanie who had disappeared into systems too overwhelmed to notice. She began to notice patterns: similar entry wounds, victim profiles, even neighborhoods. What if Westrom wasn't a one-time killer? What if he'd honed his method, waiting for the right moment, the right victim, and then slipping back into normalcy? Jensen's obsession grew. Her colleagues began to express concern. "You got your guy," one said. "Why keep digging?" Jensen had no clear answer, only a fire in her chest she couldn't extinguish. Meanwhile, the city's attention began to shift. A popular true crime podcast ran a 4-part special on Jeannie's case. Interviewing forensic analysts, legal experts, and even neighbors from the old Francis Drake Hotel, the series reignited national interest. Jensen was asked to speak on a local news segment, but she declined. "The story isn't over yet," she told the reporter. "I won't speak until I know the whole truth." Behind closed doors, she met with Carla Rivers' surviving sister, provided one crucial detail never mentioned in the original report. Carla had once worked a temporary catering event that Westrom's company had hosted. It wasn't much, but it was a lead. Jensen requested employee rosters, vendor invoices, anything she could get her hands on. A pattern began to emerge. Westrom had crossed paths with at least 2 other women who had been murdered in the same era. Each case cold, each one quietly shelved after a few months of minimal leads. She brought this information to her superior, who hesitated. "Reopen cases based on coincidence," he said. She began building a proposal for a multi-jurisdictional task force focused on cold cases with potential serial links. While bureaucratic hurdles slowed the process, media pressure from the podcast and local community groups sped it back up. Soon, Jensen found herself leading a small but dedicated team. They began re-examining evidence, interviewing long-retired witnesses, and building timelines across states. As they dug deeper, Jensen's instincts proved right. Westrom had been in several of the cities where these unsolved murders took place. While they still lacked physical proof for prosecution, the circumstantial evidence was growing louder. Jensen kept pushing, her energy never waning. Her daughter, now a teenager, often found her asleep on the couch, with open files spread out like a quilt of ghosts. One day a breakthrough came from a surprising source. A retired nurse who had worked with one of the victims remembered an offhand comment she'd made about a man she feared. She described him vaguely tall, pale, sharp-featured, but also recalled a company name embroidered on his jacket. The nurse wasn't sure, but the company matched one of Westrom's old vendors. It wasn't a confession, but it was another puzzle piece, another whisper of guilt. Jensen added it to her wall, now a tapestry of names, dates, and fragile truths. But the real turning point came when forensic technology caught up to the ambition of investigators. A new form of DNA rehydration was trialed by a private lab in Boston. Jensen sent a swab from the Carla Rivers case, labeled and sealed since 1996. Weeks passed with no news, and then one morning, an email arrived. Partial match. It's not enough for conviction, but enough to confirm her fears. Westrom's DNA was present. It reignited the fire across departments. Prosecutors weren't ready to move forward, but the case was far from cold. Jensen held the report. In her hands like a relic, she knew the legal threshold hadn't been met, but in her gut the case was solved. It was the kind of victory that didn't come with applause or headlines, only the silent satisfaction of knowing you were right. But with satisfaction came frustration. How many others had suffered in silence? Their names forgotten, their cases neglected. The idea haunted her. At a city memorial for unsolved victims, Jensen delivered a speech. She read names that had once been buried in storage units and basements of police stations. The crowd listened intently, candle flames dancing in the breeze. "These aren't just cases," she said. "They're lives. We owe it to them to keep going, even when the evidence fades and the world moves on." The story of Jeanie, Childs, once a local tragedy, had become the match that lit a much larger fire. Her case opened floodgates, not only in Minneapolis, but across the state. Grants were written, cold case units expanded, and younger detectives trained under Jensen's team. Jeannie's photo was framed and placed in the new department wing above it, a plaque that read, "Justice is never too late." For Jensen, the journey continued. Her wall of names only grew longer. Each one was a promise, and while she knew she might never solve them all, she vowed to try, because somewhere out there, another woman's story had just begun, and she would not let it end the way Jeannie's almost had. Even as time pressed forward and the public's interest began to shift toward newer scandals, fresher tragedies, Detective Sarah Jensen remained anchored in the legacy of the Jeanie Childs case. In the eyes of many, the job was drudgery, Westrom had been tried, convicted, and locked away. But for Jensen, the arrest was merely the midpoint of a much larger and ongoing narrative. Every closed case file on her desk reminded her of Jeanie's photograph staring back from the corner of her office, calm, frozen, and unspeaking. It was a silent reminder that justice, even when served, could still feel incomplete. Some nights. Long after the office emptied out, Jensen found herself alone in the evidence room, reviewing cases from the same era as Jeanie's murder. The pattern was subtle at first: missed connections, untested evidence, victims whose lifestyles had led them to be dismissed by the system. But the more she looked, the clearer the picture became. There were others, possibly many. She built a spreadsheet: names, dates, locations, victim profiles, and slowly the pattern emerged like a ghost rising from fog. Every few months, one woman disappeared from a low-income area, often with ties to vulnerable professions: hotel maids, sex workers, single mothers. Most were women of color, often overlooked by society and underreported by the media. The suspect was never seen. No direct connection was drawn to Westrom, but as Jensen pored through old forensic reports and vendor contracts, her suspicion grew. There were city logs that showed Westrom's presence in multiple towns around the time of each death. Sometimes he was registered at trade events. Other times his business credit card would pop up in convenience stores or hotels nearby. She began to map it all out on a wall in her home office, pushing pins into cities and stretching red thread across time. It was an obsession, she knew, but one she wore like armor. Even without full support from her department, Jensen began building case files under the radar. She compiled victim names, reached out to surviving families, and in some cases, exhumed remains for new forensic testing. Not all led to breakthroughs, but one case in Wisconsin did. DNA extraction from under the victim's fingernails turned up a degraded but partially matching white chromosome marker once again. It's not enough for trial, but enough to form a profile that aligned with Westrom's lineage. It was circumstantial, yes, but consistent with every theory Jensen had developed. While the bureaucracy churned slowly, the city around Jensen changed. Local newspapers continued to follow the Jeanie child story as more revelations came to light. Activist groups pushed for more cold case funding, and podcasts dedicated full seasons to exploring how the justice system had failed so many victims like her. Jensen became an unlikely local hero, not for solving one case, but for refusing to stop when the system said she should. Invitations to conferences and speaking events poured in, but Jensen declined most of them. She wasn't in it for the attention. Her attention was on the cases, on the victims, on the echoes of Jeanie in every unsolved file. Meanwhile, Jerry Westrom remained incarcerated but had begun appealing the verdict through new legal channels. Lawyers argued that the DNA was circumstantial, that the genealogy trail was thin, and that media exposure had unfairly influenced the jury. Jensen knew these tactics, desperate men trying to escape the gravity of their guilt. But she also knew that if the appeal succeeded, everything could unravel. She redoubled her efforts, focusing on new DNA technologies that might once and for all tie Westrom not just to Jeanie, but to other victims. A new cold case in Missouri caught her attention. The victim was a young hotel clerk killed in 1998. In a manner eerily similar to Jeanie's, her killer had left behind no fingerprints, only a single strand of hair that had been mishandled during the initial investigation. But with modern mitochondrial DNA testing, even damaged evidence could now be sequenced. Jensen made the request, and weeks later, the lab delivered a partial profile that matched the familial line traced back to Westrom. It wasn't a direct match, but it was enough to force the Missouri department to take a second look. Jensen presented the findings to the DA, who agreed to reopen the Missouri case. A grand jury was convened, and within weeks, Westrom was indicted for a second murder. This time, the courtroom looked different. There was no surprise, no media frenzy, just the quiet confidence of a detective who refused to let time erase truth. The victim's sister wept quietly as the indictment was read, mouthing the words, "Thank you," toward Jensen, who sat in the gallery, heart heavy but steady. Back in Minneapolis, the police department began a cold case division inspired. By Jensen's work, she was named its first director. But more importantly to her, she was given access to files that had long been forgotten. Jensen's mission had evolved. It was no longer about a single killer or even a string of cases. It was about institutional accountability, about how the system must remember those it failed. She established a protocol to annually review every case older than 10 years, regardless of how solved it had seemed. She pushed for legislation requiring mandatory genetic testing on all violent crime scene DNA. Slowly, cities beyond Minneapolis began to follow suit. The ripple from Jeannie's case had become a wave. Years later, at a ceremony held by the governor's office, Jensen stood on stage beneath a banner that read in memory, "Injustice." She accepted a plaque, not for catching a killer, but for refusing to forget. In her speech, she said simply, "The justice system is not a building. It's a promise. One we owe to the living and the dead." Behind her, a mural of Jeanie Childs glowed softly under the lights. The applause was long, and for a moment, Jensen allowed herself to feel its warmth. Then she stepped down and went back to her desk, because somewhere in a forgotten drawer, another name waited, and she would not rest until the forgotten were finally heard.